You're watching the JJ Podcast.
In the world of politics, polls are taken, published and analysed constantly, shaping strategy, messaging and the stories we tell about public opinion. Today's guest sits at the centre of that world. Dr Dorian von Freyhold is the Managing Director of Compass Polling and holds a PhD in consumer psychology.
Well, Dr Dorian von Freyhold, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. You are a pollster, and I think you're obviously more than a pollster, but for our listeners, I think so many people see you on TV and read in the paper and hear in the news about different polling. And so we thought, let's get an expert in to break this all down, how it works, how you come to these conclusions. So let's just start right there of exactly what is polling and the different types that you and your colleagues go out and investigate.
Absolutely. And thanks so much for having me, Jamie and Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here today. So at the outset, what is polling? What you really want to do with polling is figure out where is the public at, where's general sentiment at. It's very hard to guess that in a sterile environment. We all live in our own silos, including myself. And so getting a solid read on where everyday Australians are at is a massive challenge. And you won't intuit that sort of stuff. And you really need to go back to those people and ask them in a systematic way, where are they? So it's one of constructing representative samples of the areas that you're interested in. That has to be across age groups, across gender, location, education, all those sort of things. And then it's really one of eliciting the right sort of questions for what you're trying to do. So in some instances, you're really just trying to get an understanding of where people's heads at. Then another step is to give them information that you could, for example, run in a campaign and see how they respond to that. So message testing. And it's essentially that dialogue that you have with the public that's really important. And that's where, for political parties, it's so important that they keep a finger on the pulse of where everyday Australians are at any given time. And with the current state of technology, that's become more and more possible, a lot cheaper as well. And then off the back of that polling, you can conduct a lot of modelling to figure out where does the general population sit, where are the pockets of persuadables, for example, swing voters, how do you best tackle them?
You just mentioned, obviously, that online and the accessibility of people's thought has become so much easier, and you mentioned cheaper. How long have you been in the polling game, and what have you seen? Like, would social media be the biggest thing that's shifted the trend in terms of how you can do polling? And do you think polling will look the same in 2 to 3 years from now as what it does today? It's
really interesting and a great question. So if we sort of go back to, let's just call it the Crosby-Textor era, if we're looking at the Liberal Party, most of their polls historically were caddy polls, so that's telephone interviews.
Yeah, right.
And that, as a methodology, very expensive. If you're doing just caddy, you're paying $30, $40 per participant. Representative sample, that just burns coin, right? So there's a massive opportunity cost. The problem is that, if you think about who picks up the phone on a random call at 3:00 in the afternoon and gives you 5 minutes of their time for free, it's old people, right? Skews old.
Yeah.
So we saw a shift, probably from about 2010 onwards.
How long ago?
Whereby increasingly, and again, Australia's always a little further behind again. But in the US, where this game has been perfected, we saw an influx of online consumer panels. And online consumer panels are groups of people who are curated by online consumer panels. Their job is essentially to make sure that those panels are representative. So in Australia, there's a panel of about 200,000 people who can be accessed via online consumer panels. Those people are remunerated for their time, but you can go out to those and ask them questions. The advantage is it's a lot cheaper. And the results generalize pretty well. They skew a little younger, but increasingly that's dissipating as well. And you're talking $3 to $4 per participant, so it's a tenth
huge,
of the price, right?
huge.
So that then are the two methodologies that were used on Crosby Textor or Freshwater. Mainly used CATI. That's for legacy reasons. The US has almost completely moved away from CATI. Online remains an interesting component and is still used a lot in the US. And then in the US, and it's just started here, that's SMS to online. Right? So here SMS was always very expensive. The carriers just didn't really adapt. But then WhatsApp applied enough pressures that they switched. And the US, we just got back from the US studying the newest and best tricks over there. Quite literally, if you donate to the Trump campaign, you'll get 5 to 6 messages a week. Yeah.
See, don't people find that annoying? Because I know that was one thing that was coming up during our last federal election. There was a certain party that was annoying a lot of people because they were just constantly sending out text messages. Surely that becomes a point where people opt out, or people just see it as scam and don't want to risk clicking on any links or replying to anything.
Where did they get my information? Like, it really was sending people saying, how did they get my number?
So in the US, people don't find that annoying.
They've had that for the last 10 years.
Okay.
So they've become used to it. It's just part and parcel of an election year. Here it's new, right? So we're still reacting a little differently. That being said, the response rates are good. Depending on how engaged an electorate is, you'll get anywhere between 10 to 15% response rates, and in less engaged electorates, it drops a fair amount. But we will increasingly see that. Now, the best approach to polling is to actually use all three technologies and then group that. You've got CATI that skews old, online panels that skew young, SMS, which comes with a few of its own foibles. There's a response bias. Who sees a message that's probably from the Liberals and answers. There's probably people that vote Liberal. So essentially, it's one of trying to negate that world of necessary evils and getting to a representative sample, and that's where you use statistical weighting.
How do you find the data, or if you're doing the panels, and I know you're saying that people have opted in for those, but how do you ensure you've got a good cross-reference of the different electorate and the demographics? How are you finding these people? And the reason why I asked this question is because when we have told lots of people that you were coming on, the response was, I've never been polled.
I don't know anyone who's been polled.
Yeah, I had one text message during the last federal election, but outside of that, I've never been polled either. So people then like, how do they choose people? And so what is the process and how do you pick certain people?
Yep. So when it comes to polling or consumer research, it's a matter of getting a representative sample. So on the one hand, if you wanted to get your opinion out there on the regular, you would sign up to an online consumer panel. On the other hand, if it's CATI, that's a random number dialed. So you'll just randomly pick up.
And where do those random numbers come from?
So it depends on who's calling you. So if it is party affiliated or somebody who works for the party, they may well have access to the electoral roll.
Yep. Okay.
On the other hand, third parties also sell that data. So, for example, the credit rating agencies sell that data. So you can acquire that, and that's comes with contact details as well as a number of demographics. Now, as to how do you get a representative sample? So there is a regular read on what's the distribution of different demographics Australia-wide, which is the census. And so that's a sort of known truth. So what you can do, if we're just looking for representative sample in Australia, will essentially run the data collection, ideally those three methods. You then weight that, but then you weight against the known quotas from the census. And that way you get as robust a distribution, as robust a sample as you were going to get.
If you already know what you need to do to get a robust sample, as you say, to cover every demographic, to cover every age group, then it would be interesting to know what are the sources of error or bias that you're seeing in modern polling.
Yeah. Yeah, a great point. And we saw a big failing of polling at the last election. That's widely publicised. Broadly, the source of that, and this is me trying to make sense of that, because it was off, and I think that there are some things that are due to the pollster, some things that were outside of his control. Now, just to start on the pollster side, and this is widely publicised, and I don't try to get into these sort of shootouts, but I think that on the one hand, there was an overuse of caddy polls, or caddy, which is the telephone interview. So by default, they were working off a base of a sample which skews old. Mm-hmm. Old typically correlates, or older typically correlates with conservative voting. Mm-hmm. Yet they, until the day of the election, were dead sure that the Liberal Party was going to win. Campaign HQ was sure of that. They thought it was going to be a repeat of 2019. Now, that has some terrible implications, because if you're trying to make strategic decisions for an electorate or for a nation, and you have finite resources in campaigning skyrocket, you're going to end up making some terrible choices, and we saw some of that live. So there's that, the overuse of caddy, which I'll put down as a bit of a legacy of the enduring relationship between the Liberal Party and Crosby Textor, who were very caddy heavy. That's really just been unique to Australia, and the rest of the world sort of abandoned that. So you would blend it, but you just wouldn't have that as a pure sample. It's also just so expensive as that you cannot afford to do regular polling, because, as I said, a caddy sample is about 10 times the cost. So, yeah, my sense is you will, on the one hand, blow your money very quickly in your budget, which means you can't have as regular polling. My preference would always be, try to get in field regularly. Mm-hmm. And that's a bit of what we saw. They weren't in field regularly because they didn't have that much money for polling. They were putting it all into caddy polls, which were skewed. And as a result, they were essentially trying to... I like to liken it to World War II radar versus modern radar. World War II radar, it's a screen, and every 5 minutes you get a blip of where are the bombers, right?
Yep.
And then you have to try to sort of scramble, where are they going, what are they trying to do, and where should we set up the anti-aircraft guns?
Establish a pattern.
Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas if you can reduce that blip frequency to getting it every minute or every half minute, of course you're going to make much better decisions. So that was the other one. Yeah. Very expensive samples, however, skewed samples, conducted irregularly because of finite resources, leads to bad decision-making. Now, the third one, and this is what I'll broadly say was outside of their control. The election campaign, and there was that catalyst, the hurricane up in Queensland. I think... really started to fall apart about 6 weeks out. So I do strongly believe that the Liberal Party was in the fight and could have won until about 6 weeks out, when the wheels just came off. We saw a series of, I guess, bad public appearances by Dutton. Dutton was always very unpopular. We had an electorate that were unhappy with the current government, were looking around for options, were hoping that the Liberal Party would have their act together and come forward with good policies, and were just doubly jilted by the fact that we were hoping that you have everything, you have no answers here, we're really angry with you, and so we're going to protest for it back the other way. So I think that it's a risk to think that the Liberal Party is not in the game for the next election. I really believe they are. I think under the right leadership, we're in it with a fighting chance. I think a lot of the dissatisfaction was some ad hoc policies that were just thrown out there whole as bolus. A relatively effective but no genius campaign by the Labor Party, and a weak leader. They're all things that can be fixed. Yeah.
Well, let's stick with the Liberals.
Yes.
Now that we've gone down this path. This week, they're going to hopefully come to a decision over an issue that has been ripping the Liberals apart internally, but I think also externally as well. We saw 200 members in SA leave the party. I know Northern Beaches are going to be putting forward a motion to remove net zero. What does the polling suggest when you're out there speaking to people when it comes to this net zero decision? Because I know that some of the moderate side of the party are saying we can't abolish net zero because we'll lose the inner seats, and seats like the one that I ran in Warringah. Anyway, they're saying we'll never get them back. Well, you never get them back if you abolish net zero. And I obviously represented Warringah, which is one of those teal seats. When you're looking at the polling, what does it suggest of what voters would like across the board, not Liberal voters, but across the board? What do people want to see?
Can I add to that question, to that exact question? So this time last year, in November, December, before the campaign had started, Dutton had already come out and said that the Liberals were going to, one of the policy platforms was going to be to introduce nuclear. And he was leading.
But nuclear aside, though,
well,
it's because that's
that part of the answer.
Yes,
I can talk to both.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I this might just be a coincidence, but I had a lot to do with both nuclear and a lot to do with net zero. So I don't know whether you saw it. There was a leaked private briefing note that ended up on the front page of the AFR. That was us. Essentially, he had a great opportunity to brief the Liberal Party and Dan Tehan on where the public sits on net zero. So let's just start the net zero. And I'll just put some broad numbers out there that I think frame this debate really well. So first of all, about 80% of Australians do want some version of net zero. And if we just have a look at that through the context of the Voice, it's a similar sentiment. Most Australians felt that we should do something when it comes to Indigenous, and that we do owe them some kind of payback. That being said, as soon as you introduce a hip pocket impact, so if we look at net zero, as soon as you introduce a hip pocket impact to introducing net zero, support falls away really, really quickly. I mean, the base rule for any of this stuff is don't mess with people's hip pocket. For the Voice, it was that there may be vetoes on topics that are outside of in Indigenous matters that will have a direct impact on my either quality of life or lifestyle and cost of living. So, again, 80% of Australians want some action and want to move towards net zero. Now, if, however, I ask you the question of if there was an energy retailer who provided energy just from fossil fuels, no renewables, and it was cheaper than your current provider, would you switch? Right? This is really important. About 72 to 73% of people say they'll switch. That's without me even saying by how much cheaper it is. All right, so you can see that strong hip pocket driver there. About 75% of Australians think that we should make more use of our coal and gas reserves. All right, so it's a complex issue. Again, the strategy here, I believe, and never trust a pollster with an opinion, but the strategy here, I believe, is one of keeping net zero, but not in its current structure. So keep the verbiage or come up with a different name for it, but make sure that net zero or some kind of emissions reduction is achieved without passing a whole heap of cost onto the end consumer. And that's where, for the current government, the real problem is they look to roll out
wind and
solar.
And nowhere in the world has it made it cheaper.
No, Bowen wants to get to 82% renewables by 2030. We're at 35% at the moment, and our energy prices have quadrupled since the 90s. Now, the correlation between wind and solar in the grid and energy prices is 0.96, an incredibly high correlation, right? So if you try to get from that 33 we're at now and get to 82% in the next 5 years, that is going to be incredibly expensive and essentially the tax.
We don't even have to look globally, though. In our own country, the state of South Australia has the highest amount of wind and solar in its grid, which really surprised me because I think in terms of solar on the roofs of houses, Queensland are the number one state in the world, like globally. But put wind in the mix, South Australia have the highest in their grid and the highest energy prices in Australia.
Absolutely.
So it just proves.
And looking at wind and solar as well, globally, I mean, that relationship between percentage of wind and solar in the grid and price per kilowatt hour is a very linear relationship. And we are in that sort of scary upper quadrant, whereby we have already very high renewables in our grid, and one of the highest energy prices in the world, despite having a lot of natural energy-rich resources in our backyard. And the Australian public is rightly infuriated by that. Now, we, as I said, we all live in bubbles. We all enjoy politics. We all kind of like to talk about these topics. For the average Australian, they don't really care about politics. And energy is one of those very few areas where policy hits their hip pocket in a tangible way on the regular, and they're reminded on the quarterly.
Yes,
So there's
every time you open your bill.
opportunity to say, look, just look at your power bill. You can see it. It always goes up. It always goes up by decent margins. So it's going to be one of the biggest topics for the next election.
Well, I actually think this week is make or break for the Liberals. But back to Jamie's point regarding nuclear, during the federal campaign, the Labor government were very, very good at doing that scare campaign that it was going to be $600 billion. And so people were very much like, whoa, I'm not going to go down that path. And the Liberals weren't very good at counteracting that
the renewables
debate.
are more like 1.5%.
Or just putting out the facts of what it could have been costing, and also the fact that nuclear lasts for 90 years. But that aside, as Jamie alluded to before, when nuclear was the only policy that Peter Dutton and the Liberals had at one point, and especially in January when they were dominating the polls. And I know we can't look too closely at the polls off the back of what we've seen as a result, but that was the one time that they were doing well. And I know that when we were out speaking to people, what I found really interesting was a lot of the younger generation were very pro-nuclear, very pro. What are your readings when you're talking to people? Are they also open to the idea of nuclear, but perhaps going out to the market versus the taxpayer funding the nuclear power stations?
It's fascinating area, and it comes back to, and you'll see me come back to this very often. It comes back to the hip pocket. The average Australian doesn't care about the technology used to generate electricity. They care about the power bill. What it's going to cost them and their hip pocket. All right. So for the nuclear debate, and again, I had a lot to do with the nuclear framing and debate as such, and work closely with some of the ministers. For the nuclear debate, that meant that unless you could prove that this was going to make energy cheaper, and the cost wasn't going to end up with the end consumer, it was going to be a hard one to get across the line. Now, exactly the same applies to Chris Bowen's renewables as well. I mean, and he's the Labor in general has tried to really run that line of renewables are the cheapest form of energy. Now, only about 30 or 32% of Australians still believe that lie. Now, we track that over time. If we go back to 2020, that was about a 50-50 split. So the wheels are coming off that buggy at pace. When it comes to essentially nuclear and the nuclear debate, what needed to be proven, and this is where Dutton could have been somewhat stronger, it needed to be proven that long term this would be the cheapest form of electricity. Now, in Australia, the thing is that coal reigns supreme. We have a lot of coal. It's very cheap coal.
And we're still sending it all offshore. That's the hypocrisy. The Australian people are like, we want low emissions, but we'll send it offshore so that they can all create cheap energy.
Well,
I don't understand that.
That's right. No, they create cheap energy, build solar panels, mine their lithium, create inverters, sell it back to us at a hell of a premium.
Yeah, exactly.
There is...
Are we just stupid? Like, what do polls show? Anything around hypocrisy?
We just got back from the US, and what you really notice there is a 180 in energy policy. I mean, quite literally, we talked to a number of hedge funds and investment funds, and of course the Republicans. They're very reticent to invest in renewables, and they see it as a great risk. I mean, anything that's coal, gas, oil, they're really happy to invest in. Australia if that's the Queen Mary, the US, we're using that slipstream, and we will turn, right? And that's where a lot of our money comes from. So we will see a natural appetite by investors to invest in that space. So it's really a fascinating debate that I think has the opportunity to certainly divide politics, but the Australian population is unified on this one. They just want cheaper electricity.
What about the polling of the leadership within the Liberals? What is that looking like?
Actually, and the leader makes a difference. I think we've learned that it's helped.
I think the leader does have an important role to play in terms of bringing people in. If you're a leader that inspires people and have great policies and you can sell them well, I do think that would bring people in. But I'm curious because it was only a few months ago when there was some polling done and it was very low that people even knew who Susan Lee was. How is that looking? And do you actually also poll about potential other leaders? Like, are there any other names being thrown out there in the polls that people resonate with?
Yeah. I guess to the first point, a leader's important. We have a great recent example of the importance of a leader in the last election, whereby Peter Dutton, who has many very good qualities as a leader, was, however, from the outset, very much disliked by the public. And that image had been shaped over a long time period. He held a bunch of very difficult portfolios. And it's a hard one to come out of that smelling like roses. He's an ex-policeman. That's difficult. And he's an odd-looking cat. And let's face it. And the impact of that, and keep in mind that the average voter is rather superficial. The impact of that on the party's vote was certainly net negative. Overall, is the leader important? Absolutely. Even if it's just as from a political perspective, they're a figurehead, but from a public perspective, they're the face of the campaign. And there's a reason why Hollywood actors do pretty all right in politics, and that's in part because they speak well and they have the looks. It's something so deeply ingrained in our psyche, coming from a psychology background. You cannot avoid that, and you do need to keep it in mind. And we have some good-looking leaders in the lineup. We have Angus Taylor, we have Andrew Hastie. Susan Lee, she's obviously struggling at the moment. I hold on to her leadership, and I don't really want to get into the debate whether she's the right person for the job. But we certainly do have to see a rebuild of the Liberal Party, and I don't know to what extent she's managing to keep the two factions together and everybody pleased. I'm just working off what's in the media here as well. That being said, we do a lot of work on candidates, on personality attributes that are conducive to being voted in. One common myth: you do not particularly, you don't have to be liked as a politician, but you should be seen as strong, and most importantly, deliver on promises.
I think America is an example of that. I think a lot of people. I understand why Trump won. Yeah. It doesn't mean I like him as a person, but I really like his strength. I think I like that people knew he was going to do what he said he'd do.
Yep.
And at the moment, we've got a lot of weakness in our leaders, and I can't stand that. I know Jamie wants to wrap up. I just wanted to ask one question. You've mentioned your trip to the US a couple of times. I just want to ask, from a historical perspective with polling, how often does Australia trail countries like the United States and the United Kingdom? So at the moment, over recent years, we've seen a real backlash, a real swinging of the pendulum against immigration, against woke, where you've got a right-wing leader who's shown strength, standing up, and the people love it. Do you think Australia could go with the right leader? The same thing could happen here.
Yeah. And Australia's its own sort of flavour. And I think that there's always a temptation to look to the US or the UK for inspiration on how to play that game. And there are plenty of things we can learn from overseas. And we are from a overall political perspective, we're a very small nation. If we have a look at how much funding we have for an election, it's minuscule compared to the US. So if you have a look at the campaigning machinery that's available in the US, there's massive inspiration to be had there. We, and in particular the Liberal Party, are very poor on the technology side, whereas the Labour Party is pretty good. So do I think that we should follow in the footsteps of the US or the UK or take inspiration from those places? Absolutely. I think that the real key is to test that, though, because we do, even though we're culturally not too dissimilar, and from a votership perspective, and from a voting system perspective, very different to the US, pretty similar to the UK. But we should always make sure that we test these things before we go into field. And that's, I guess if we're looking towards wrapping up, that's a key message, that the technology and the tools are out there to test things before you go to market. And if you look at any large corporate, before they put any product in field, they'll do a lot of testing, focus groups, pilots, small launches, geographically see how things fly. It's a terrible error. We saw it during the last election, to just sort of in a silo think, let's try it out. What about a policy against working from home? Yeah, let's do it. Let's chuck it out there. And it blows up in your face. You do not want that kind of live blow up in your face. Test it, plan things well in advance, stick to the script. So they're sort of, again, if just reflecting on your question, US, UK, again, I think there's inspiration. Test it. Some of it will work, some of it won't work, but you should know in advance before you do the big launch on these things.
Fair call. I just want to quickly also touch on the Labour Party. What's the polling been like around their performance? And in particular, are voters still happy with Anthony Albanese as the Prime Minister?
Yep. Anthony Albanese occupies an interesting niche. If we just compare him to Dutton, Anthony always won on the side of, who would you like to go out for a beer with?
Yeah, he is the larrikin.
He's the larrikin, everyone. I think of like Bob Hawke and the sculling the schooner type of thing. When Dutton didn't do that shoey, I was like, he should have done it. Yeah.
Kind of in a goofy, friendly way. And he's the guy that mows your strip of the lawn and gives you away, So the Labour Party have a lot of problems, and they can certainly be wedged on energy pretty easily right now, and a number of other places. The general rule of thumb is, in Australia, politicians are voted out, not in. So for Albanese, the big challenge will be to survive the next 3 years without doing something too stupid or goofy. Yeah. Now, I should say here, and again, as a guy who is in the polling game, the machinery that the Labour Party has at their fingertips and deploys is very good. They regularly send people over to the US. They've consistently invested in their top technology. Their stack is solid. They do a lot with AI, a lot with social sentiment mining. It's probably a stack that is maybe 5 years behind where the US is at. On the Liberal Party side, it's probably more like 15 years. Right? So it's asymmetric warfare. I mean, a lot of the technology used by the Liberal Party is programmed in Fortran, which is a programming language that died out in the late 70s.
Who's around to tell them that? Knock on the door of the Liberals. Hello, coalition.
Dorian.
You guys, that's too far behind. Catch up.
Yeah. I mean, you need to have the right people in leadership positions in the party who understand the importance of that. And it's hard to leapfrog evolution in the technology game. So, I mean, we are always inspired, in part because we also have a large portion of our business which is from the corporate world, to stay on top of these things. And again, the tech stacks that you use to help Metcash do better, or Coca-Cola or KFC, or whoever your client is, in many ways resembles the tech stack that you'll use for a political campaign. At the end of the day, you're in the game of persuading the public to, whether it's buy a donut or vote for a certain person. The psychological mechanisms are identical. The research approach is identical. Your targeting is identical. And again, technology is the massive enabler there. And you had a great question early on, which was how has polling evolved as well? And I'll just mention here that the ability to build large language models and leverage AI, mine public sentiment data, process that in relative real time is a super interesting development. It's taking the US by storm. We have some of that technology as well at our fingertips. And if you think about it from a polling perspective, you'll run your polling to get an understanding of where's the vote at, but then you'll use the social sentiment data, which is mining X, Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, etc., to get an idea of momentum and an idea of how you should react to the media cycle. So, a certain scandal, is the public really angry about that? Should I come out loud and proud on the issue, or can I just let it kind of ripple through and no one will notice it? And that's where a lot of the US tech stack is now going. And I've got the basics down really pat, but then it's really how do you leverage AI now? And that's where the arms race is at.
Especially when all of these technologies and developments require more energy.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Dorian, thank you so much for your time. It has been very, very interesting and insightful into the world of polling.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to the JJ Podcast.